December 19, 2025, Brussels, Belgium. Inside the European Council headquarters, the most powerful leaders on the continent had been arguing for 16 hours straight. A decision that would reshape the financial war against Russia hung in the balance completely. For months, the European Union had been preparing something unprecedented in modern financial history. They wanted to seize $105 billion worth of frozen Russian assets sitting in European banks. This money belonged to the Russian central bank, locked since the invasion of Ukraine. The plan was bold, and the message was clear to the world. Russia would pay for the destruction it caused with its own frozen money. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen championed this idea across the continent for months. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz stood beside her, pushing for the seizure to happen quickly. They called it the reparations loan, and it carried a sense of justice that resonated everywhere. Inside that Brussels meeting room, the confidence began to crumble hour after hour. Ministers who had publicly supported the plan started raising difficult questions behind closed doors. Belgium's Prime Minister Bart de Wever pushed back hard against the proposal throughout the night. Italy joined him in opposition. Then Hungary, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, Bulgaria, and Malta followed closely. By 4 a.m., the plan was dead. European Council President Antonio Costa stepped in front of cameras looking exhausted but composed. The EU would abandon the seizure of Russian assets for now. Instead, European governments would borrow 90 billion euros from financial markets on their own. Taxpayers across Europe would guarantee this massive debt through the EU budget. The leaders who had promised to make Russia pay chose to bill their own citizens instead. A $105 billion pot of Russian money remained untouched in Belgian bank accounts. Something had spooked these leaders badly enough to walk away from this fortune entirely. A lawsuit from Moscow, a warning from the European Central Bank, and pressure from Washington all played their part in this reversal. Russia's $225 billion counterstrike, December 12, 2025, 1 week before the Brussels summit took place. The Russian central bank filed a lawsuit in the Moscow arbitration court against Euroclear. The amount they demanded was staggering by any measure at all. Russia wanted 18.2 trillion rubles in damages, which equals roughly $229 billion at the exchange rate. This was more than double the amount of frozen assets Europe was planning to seize. The timing of this lawsuit was calculated with precision by Moscow strategists. European leaders were scheduled to meet in just 7 days to finalize the asset seizure. Russia filed the case right before that crucial summit to send a clear message. The Kremlin wanted Brussels to understand exactly what was at stake for everyone involved. The logic of the lawsuit was straightforward and brutal in its simplicity. Russia argued that Euroclear was holding its money and refusing to return it as required. The frozen assets belonged to the Russian central bank under international law, technically speaking. By keeping the money locked up, Euroclear was causing Russia billions in lost profits yearly. Moscow demanded compensation for the full value plus all the earnings they had missed out on. European officials dismissed the lawsuit publicly as speculative and legally groundless immediately. They argued that a Russian court ruling would have zero power in Belgium at all. This was technically true under normal circumstances between sovereign nations at peace. But Moscow had a much larger strategy in play behind this lawsuit filing. Russia knew exactly where Europe's weak point was located in the financial system. Euroclear held about 17 billion euros worth of assets inside Russia in various accounts. Western banks, investment funds, and pension funds still had billions stuck in Russian Type C accounts. These were frozen Western assets that Russia could seize at any moment it chose to. The Kremlin's message to Brussels was clear and impossible to misunderstand in negotiations. If Europe seized $105 billion of Russian money, Moscow would take $229 billion from Euroclear. They would drain Western assets held inside Russia to satisfy the court judgment against Euroclear. European companies and banks would pay the price for what Russia called the theft of sovereign funds. Preliminary court hearing was scheduled for January 16, 2026, just weeks after the summit. The clock was ticking loudly, and European leaders understood what was coming if they proceeded. Europe's weak point every single day. Trillions of dollars flow through a company that most people have never heard about. That company is Euroclear, headquartered in Brussels, Belgium, at the center of European finance. Banks, pension funds, and governments from more than 90 countries trust Euroclear with their money daily. By the third quarter of 2025, Euroclear was holding over 42 trillion euros in assets for its clients. The company processed 331 million transactions worth more than 1,162 trillion euros total. When someone buys a bond or sells a stock in Europe, Euroclear handles the transfer behind the scenes. The company moves ownership from seller to buyer and makes sure the cash arrives properly. This makes Euroclear the plumbing of European capital markets in every practical sense possible. If this plumbing breaks down, the entire financial system stops flowing immediately across the continent. Russia knew exactly where to aim its legal attack against European financial infrastructure directly. Of the 185 billion euros in frozen Russian assets held at Euroclear, nearly 176 billion had already turned into cash. By late 2025, the remaining 9 billion euros worth of Russian securities were set to mature in 2026 and 2027. This money was piling up in Euroclear's accounts every single month without any way to leave legally. Nearly 85% of Euroclear's own balance sheet became tied to these sanctioned Russian assets directly. The company was earning billions in interest just from holding this trapped money in its accounts. In the first 9 months of 2025, the frozen Russian assets generated 3.9 billion euros in interest earnings. But Euroclear also had a critical vulnerability that Moscow understood very well from the start. A Russian court ruling against the company could trigger immediate seizure of Western holdings trapped inside Russia. Pension funds, investment managers, and major banks all stood to lose billions if Moscow decided to retaliate. Belgian Prime Minister Bart de Wever warned Parliament about this exact danger before the December summit. He said that seizing Russian assets could trigger a snowball effect across the financial system rapidly. Euroclear might lose its ability to meet obligations to clients around the world completely as a result. Confidence in European financial markets would weaken at the worst possible time for the continent overall. Euroclear had become both the prize and the hostage in this high-stakes financial standoff between global powers. Belgium says no. Belgian Prime Minister Bart de Wever stood firm against the entire European establishment throughout. December 2025, he had 3 conditions that Belgium would accept before touching any Russian assets whatsoever. First, he demanded a backstop mechanism that would guarantee Euroclear could return funds to Russia if required. Second, he wanted all potential liabilities shared equally among every EU member state without exception. Third, he insisted that frozen Russian assets held in other countries be included in any plan moving forward. De Wever put it simply to the other European leaders during negotiations that week in Brussels. If we have a good parachute, then we all jump together from this plane as a united group. Belgium would carry the risk alone under the current proposal on the table before them all. The Belgian Prime Minister used a memorable comparison to explain his position to the press clearly. Euroclear is the only financial institution in the world transferring profits from Russian assets to Ukraine. That is the chicken that lays the golden eggs for everyone involved in this arrangement. The European Commission was proposing to serve that chicken for dinner instead of collecting eggs. De Wever also made a historical argument that resonated with many skeptical leaders in the room. Even during World War II, German assets held in neutral countries were frozen by those governments. Those assets were never seized or spent by anyone, despite the massive conflict raging across Europe. Confiscating the sovereign funds of another country had simply never been done before in modern financial history. Other EU nations talked publicly about supporting Belgium and sharing the risk with their neighbor. Germany and the Netherlands said they were prepared to back up the loan with their own guarantees. But when the detailed texts arrived, the commitments were vague and filled with legal loopholes throughout. Italy and Bulgaria hesitated to sign anything that could expose their own budgets to Russian retaliation later. France quietly backed away from binding commitments as the summit approached closer each day. The solidarity that European leaders preached in press conferences evaporated when real money was on the line. De Wever warned that Belgium would mount a legal challenge against the EU if the decision proceeded without proper guarantees. He also pointed out that the frozen assets represented a bargaining chip in future peace negotiations. Spending that money now would eliminate leverage that Europe might need desperately at the negotiating table later. The ECB's secret warning while politicians debated in Brussels. The European Central Bank delivered a message that changed everything completely. ECB President Christine Lagarde had been watching the reparations loan debate with growing alarm throughout the fall. She understood something that many political leaders had overlooked in their enthusiasm for the seizure plan. The euro was more than just a currency for European citizens to spend at local shops. It was the second most important reserve currency in the entire world at that time. Central banks from Saudi Arabia to Brazil to Indonesia held euros in their reserves as protection. In 2024, the euro accounted for roughly 20% of foreign exchange reserves held by central banks globally. The US dollar held about 58%, making the euro a critical alternative for diversification purposes. Countries trusted Europe precisely because property rights were sacred under European law for everyone involved. Lagarde warned that seizing sovereign assets would send a dangerous signal to the entire global financial community. If Europe could take Russian money today, what would stop it from taking Chinese money tomorrow? What about Saudi money or Indonesian reserves held in European banks and depositories? The message would be clear to every nation watching these events unfold in real time. European banks welcome your deposits until your government falls out of favor with Brussels. The ECB chief expressed deep concern that this move could undermine the euro's credibility across global markets. Foreign investors might start dumping euro-denominated assets if they feared similar treatment in the future. Central banks around the world could begin shifting their reserves toward gold or the Chinese yuan instead. Capital flight from Europe would push borrowing costs higher for every EU government struggling with deficits already. Lagarde made one thing absolutely clear to the negotiating teams working on the reparations loan details. The European Central Bank would refuse to provide a liquidity backstop for this plan under any circumstances. If Euroclear faced a crisis because of Russian retaliation, the ECB would offer zero support to rescue it. This decision removed the safety net that might have made the seizure possible to execute safely. The ECB's position boiled down to a simple calculation about priorities and survival for Europe. Funding Ukraine was a political goal that leaders could pursue through other means available to them. Preserving the euro and financial stability was a survival goal that could accept zero compromise from anyone. Italy's banks and Trump's shadow. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni had initially supported the idea of seizing Russian assets for Ukraine. As the December summit approached, her position shifted dramatically based on cold financial calculations. Italian banks still had billions of euros trapped inside Russia that Moscow could seize at any moment. Unicredit alone had approximately 3.5 billion euros in capital stranded in Russian operations at that time. Banca Intesa held another 2 billion euros in exposed assets within Russian borders as well. Business sources in Moscow estimated that Italian assets vulnerable to Russian retaliation totaled around 8 billion euros. Beyond the major banks, roughly 70 Italian companies still operating in Russia held combined assets worth 2.5 billion euros. If Europe seized Russian money, Moscow had already announced it would target European banks in Russian arbitration courts. The Russian Central Bank made clear it would seek damages from any European institution connected to the frozen assets. Italy quietly joined Belgium in opposing the reparations loan as these risks became clearer during negotiations. Meloni understood that Italian bank shareholders would effectively pay for any seizure through lost assets. National interest came before collective European signaling when real money was on the table for everyone. Across the Atlantic, another shadow loomed over the Brussels summit throughout the discussions taking place. The Trump administration had released a 28-point peace plan just weeks before the European meeting in December. Point 14 of that plan proposed something that alarmed European leaders watching from their capitals. The United States wanted $100 billion of frozen Russian assets invested in American-led reconstruction efforts for Ukraine. Washington would receive 50% of the profits from this venture under the proposed terms. The plan suggested that frozen European funds would eventually be unfrozen as part of any deal. Trump viewed these assets as negotiating leverage to bring Russia to the table for serious discussions. If Europe spent the money on weapons now, that leverage would disappear completely from future negotiations. European leaders faced an uncomfortable choice between Washington and their own plans for the funds. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen called the December summit Europe's independence moment 10 times in one speech. The message was clear to everyone listening closely in European capitals that week. Europe needed to act before America grabbed control of these assets for its own purposes entirely. The hidden 1989 treaty, February 9, 1989, Moscow, Soviet Union. The Cold War was ending, and diplomats from Belgium and the Soviet Union gathered to sign an agreement. They called it a bilateral investment treaty designed to encourage business between both nations. The document promised fair treatment and legal protection for investments made across their borders. Nobody in that room could have imagined this treaty would threaten European unity 36 years later. Russia inherited this agreement as the successor state to the Soviet Union after the collapse in 1991. The treaty remained legally binding between Belgium and Russia through all the years that followed quietly. Article after article guaranteed fair and equitable treatment for all covered investments under the agreement terms. Most importantly, the treaty explicitly prohibited expropriation or nationalization of protected assets without compensation. Any measures having similar effects to expropriation were also banned under the treaty language itself. Belgian Prime Minister Bart de Wever described this treaty as a sword of Damocles hanging over his government. If Belgium allowed the EU to use Russian assets held at Euroclear, Russia could sue under this 1989 agreement. The case would go to international arbitration tribunals in neutral locations outside Europe entirely. These tribunals operate in places like Hong Kong, Singapore, Dubai, and other financial centers around the world. Legal experts had already analyzed the risks facing Belgium under this old Soviet-era agreement carefully. Unlike domestic courts or the International Court of Justice, investment arbitration tribunals operate very differently. Russia would argue that Belgium violated investor protections by allowing the seizure of sovereign funds. An arbitration panel could potentially force Belgium to pay massive damages for breaching the treaty obligations. The consequences of losing such a case would extend far beyond just paying damages to Russia. If Belgium lost an arbitration ruling, the judgment would be enforceable against Belgian state assets globally. Belgian ships could be seized in foreign ports to satisfy the judgment against the government entirely. Belgian planes, diplomatic accounts, and government properties abroad would all become targets for enforcement actions. A senior Russian banker threatened Europe with 50 years of litigation if the reparations loan moved forward. Russia had access to multiple overlapping jurisdictions for bringing legal claims against Belgium and other nations. The 1989 treaty was just one weapon in an arsenal of legal tools available to Moscow's lawyers now. European leaders realized they were walking into a legal minefield that could drain resources for decades ahead. The bill comes due. European taxpayers became the guarantors of Ukraine's survival after that Brussels summit concluded. The €90 billion loan would be repaid by Ukraine only once Russia paid war reparations. Given that Moscow shows zero intention of compensating anyone for the destruction caused, the EU budget will likely absorb this cost eventually over the coming years. Successive European budgets will carry this burden for decades ahead. The €210 billion in frozen Russian assets remain untouched in Belgian accounts to this day. Euroclear continues to hold this massive sum while earning billions in interest from it annually. The money sits frozen, a hostage in a standoff that could last for generations into the future. European leaders reserve the right to use these assets eventually, but nobody knows when or how legally. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz had championed the reparations loan throughout the fall of 2025 aggressively. The summit outcome was a cold shower for Berlin on the biggest European stage possible anywhere. Germany ended up accepting more EU joint debt, something Berlin had long campaigned against in past years. Belgian Prime Minister Bart de Wever got everything he fought for during those intense weeks of negotiations instead. He called the final agreement a stable, legally robust, and financially credible European solution for everyone involved. Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic won protection from any financial obligations tied to the loan package. Viktor Orban declared the reparations loan dead before entering the summit, and events proved him correct entirely. The EU of 27 member states turned into a coalition of 24 willing participants on Ukraine funding. Russia's legal and financial threats had worked exactly as Moscow intended them to function against Europe. The $229 billion lawsuit, the 1989 treaty, and the danger to Euroclear all combined to paralyze European action. The Kremlin demonstrated that its integration into global financial plumbing remained too deep to cut cleanly. The December 2025 summit revealed a fundamental truth about power in the modern world. Politicians talk about justice and making aggressors pay for their crimes in passionate speeches regularly. But when the moment comes to act, the financial system protects itself above all other considerations involved. Legal risks, banking vulnerabilities, and fear of market instability overruled every moral argument presented at that table. European governments decided their own taxpayers would foot the bill rather than challenge the foundations of international finance. The war continues, the assets stay frozen, and ordinary Europeans pay the bill for it all.